of the Center of Biomedical Ethics and Culture at SIUT. We are webcasting from Karachi, Pakistan. So while we prefer to have a physical format of the CBEC forum as we used to do in the past, but for obvious reasons, complying with the pandemic SOPs, we've gone virtual. And there are actually some major advantages of going virtual. We have our reach, which is much wider. We can invite scholars like we have Dr. Martin today, and I'll introduce her in a bit. We will also have the opportunity to open this feed live to our participants, not only throughout Pakistan, but abroad also. And I'm delighted that we have an audience, which is an international audience of relevant people from both Pakistan, our own alumni, and people who have, who not our alumni, but are working in the area of bioethics education in Pakistan and also in Kenya. Our colleagues involved in the CBEC Kemri Bioethics Training Initiative based out of Nairobi. So it's a wonderful opportunity to have all of you around for this session. I will be introducing the guest speaker today, but I would like to mute your microphones so that there's no disturbance. And if at all possible, have your videos on so that we can see people and it looks more lively. And not have it the other way around with your camera off and the mic on, then that is a little disturbing. Okay, so I'd like to introduce our speaker for today, which is Professor Dominique Martin. Dr. Martin is Associate Professor in Bioethics and Professionalism in the School of Medicine at Deakin University in Australia. She studied medicine and arts as undergraduate degrees with majors in philosophy and English. And what an interesting and challenging combination of subjects she had. Then she went on to do a PhD in applied ethics at the University of Melbourne with a focus on organ transplantation, basically talking about the markets in human biological materials. So her interest in ethics of organ transplantation are well established and clearly overlap with SIUT and our mission over here for ethical organ transplantation in Pakistan and around the world. Dr. Martin is a member of the NHMRC Organ and Tissue Working Committee and also of the Doha International Academy of Organ Donation. She is also associate editor of the journal Transplantation. She is past co-chair of the Declaration of Istanbul Custodian Group and the Ethics Committee of the Transplantation Society. Dominique has also worked with the WHO, the World Health Organization, and also the Australian Organ and Tissue Authority on ethical issues in donation and transplantation. She has actually been a visitor to SIUT and participated in our conference just a few years ago in the good old days, and also visited our center at that time. In May of 2021, Dr. Martin very successfully hosted a virtual conference of the Asia Pacific Bioethics Education Network, the APBEN. And I would urge our participants to actually check this network out. It's a very useful network to be associated with. At Deakin University, she has been involved in bioethics education, not only in the face-to-face sessions, but also online. And her online teaching experience, unlike most of us who were forced into this realm, which actually predates the pandemic for her, she was involved in bioethics online classes much before the pandemic started. And this session today is designed to learn from her experience as a bioethics educator in the virtual realm. The session has been divided into 3 segments dealing with online curriculum design, online pedagogical approaches that work best, and assessment methodologies that are more appropriate for the virtual classroom. Her segments, she's talk is divided into 3 segments, and each segment after her talk has about 15 minutes of question and answer session where you can actually interact with her. And I would urge our participants on Zoom to please put the questions that you want to ask her in the chat box as they occur to you so that you don't forget. We will be compiling them as we go along, and I'll be putting them to Dr. Martin for her to respond during each of the 3 question and answer sessions. So don't forget to put in your questions in the chat box. And the people on Facebook who are also joining the Facebook live feed, can put their comments on our in the comment section, and we will be compiling them and also putting them up for Dr. Martin to respond. Time permitting, we may also be able to take people online and ask questions themselves. Please, if that happens, just if you want that to happen, raise your hand in the hand raising feature on Facebook, not on Facebook, on Zoom, and we'll be happy to accommodate you if we have time. Keep your comments brief. So with that introduction and some housekeeping rules, I would like to turn over the session to Professor Martin.
Thank you so much for that very generous introduction and for the invitation to be part of this workshop. I confess I feel something of a fraud to be talking about, sort of pedagogy. And I should warn you that this is going to be quite a practically oriented session. I've had the privilege of studying higher education, so I've sort of learned about the theory and the pedagogy, but most of what I feel I now know, and I'm glad that I know about online teaching, has been learned through practical experience. And that's one of the things that I think most of us discover the more we teach. We learn from what we do, probably like any other aspect of learning. But hopefully some of the things that I'm going to share with you today, if you're less familiar with online teaching, might enable you to avoid perhaps some of the mistakes that I've made in my sort of 9 years of teaching experience online. So some of the things that I had to learn the hard way, maybe I can help you to avoid the hard way of learning. So I'm going to talk briefly first about the basic principles of online curriculum design, then go through some learning activities. I'm very happy to share with you examples from my own teaching experience and talk briefly about assessment, but we will break that up, as Professor Jaffrey said, with some discussion time. So the first thing is to think about online teaching, how not to do it. So these are all of the mistakes that I spent, I have to say, not just 1 year making, I spent a number of years making. And I think there are also potentially some of the common mistakes that we make, whether we're teaching online or in face-to-face format. So when you're teaching ethics, there's always this temptation to think of all the topics, all the ethical issues that you want to focus on. And this is why we see so many curricula that have termination of pregnancy, euthanasia, organ trafficking, all of these sort of classic applied ethics issues, which aren't always necessarily what your students need to learn. We also have a temptation to focus on topics that we have a personal interest in, perhaps that we've studied ourselves. The second mistake, and particularly I think a common mistake with online teaching, and one that I did learn relatively early on because someone taught this to me from their experience, is that you shouldn't be tempted to, you discover some new technology, you go to a fantastic teaching and learning conference and you see these amazing things, these amazing tools or platforms that people are using. And the first thought is, wow, that's spectacular. I want to use that for my program. And then you spend an awful lot of time trying to acquire the technology, learning how to use it, for example, and then trying to fit it into your curriculum. And what often you then wind up doing is building a curriculum around a specific technological tool or approach. And that's not necessarily the best fit for what you're trying to do. So don't start with letting some cool technology drive your curriculum. Also, don't just invite famous people to talk. It's fantastic, but you spend a lot of time trying to acquire them, fit into their busy schedules, and then maybe it turns out they're not actually that good a teacher, or maybe they're not going to teach the kinds of things that your students need to learn. And finally, I see this happening all the time, and again, it's sort of a very understandable approach. People think, I'm going to develop something new, I'm going to turn online. The first thought is, well, I'm going to need money for this, and I'm going to need resources. I'm going to need a lot of timetable space, perhaps, from the students. And those are often the things that we have very little control over, that we have little power, perhaps, to acquire. If you can get them, fantastic. But don't start with that. What I'd suggest that you do is to start by determining what your goals and priorities are. And all of this applies whether you're talking about a 1-hour lecture opportunity that you've been given. Someone says, hey, can you come and teach our students ethics of research or the ethics of clinical practice? Or if you're asked to develop an entire subject or an entire course. Start by thinking about what are your goals and priorities for that program? What do you want to achieve through this teaching? And why are you thinking about teaching ethics online? It used to be because it was cool. Everyone said, oh, we should do this online teaching. Now, of course, it's a matter of a necessity, but it may not necessarily be what you need to do or the best thing for your students. So just don't take it for granted that online teaching is going to be the way to go. Consider not just what your potential goals are, but what are the goals of your prospective students and other stakeholders. If you're developing this perhaps in the context of someone else's course, why do they ask you to do some ethics teaching? What do they want the students to get out of it? And what do your students want? Because if you don't have some understanding of their goals and priorities, you might develop something fantastic that's going to be completely ill-fitted to those students, and then it's going to be very disappointing for you. Also consider the resources and opportunities that you have. Try not to focus too much on all of the things that you don't have. Look at the strengths and the resources that you do have. Even say, if you've got teachers who don't know much about ethics, but they have a lot of skills in other areas, and think about how you can make use of them. The other things that I've learned, always have a plan. It doesn't matter whether your plan is perfect, but always go in with a plan. Otherwise, you're going about everything in the wrong direction. And by the time you realize that you need to work out a plan, you've lost an awful lot of time. And the one resource that we have as teachers, most valuable resource, is our time. The other thing is to apply the principles of good curriculum design, not just at the top level of your curriculum. I see that a lot, and I used to do this a lot myself, come up with a grand plan, the high-level learning outcomes for a course, and then we don't think about how that's going to be translated at each level down to, say, the level of a particular class. And so you have this fantastic high-level program, but the reality on the ground of learning, teaching, and assessment is something completely different. So you have to think about how you're going to apply and translate those principles across every level of your teaching program. And try to keep things simple. Start simple and then add the complexity when you've got a better feel for how things are going. And if there are people maybe who should be included in the designing and the planning, or you want their perspectives, you want to find out more about what they think about things, involve them early, not only because no one likes to be asked to get involved at the last minute, but again, you will lose time and you'll find it harder then to go back and change things, particularly in an online environment. It's usually a matter of progressive building. And so if you go in the wrong direction, you're going to have to go really very far back in the opposite direction to try and catch up if you've gone off track. Other things to be mindful of: the potential differences between online and face-to-face curriculum design, that sort of perhaps lack of flexibility in making adjustments. If, for example, you're recording a lot of your materials before a course develops, it's much harder for you to adapt in response to, say, feedback that you receive, or if things don't work out as expected. Usually it will take you more time. I'd love to say that after years of experience now, if I need to record a learning resource for students, I'm much better with the technological side of things. But mostly what I've learned is that I need to stop myself the first time I've made a recording and say that's good enough, rather than spending 5 days re-recording, trying to achieve some kind of perfection. When I teach live, that never worries me. I realize it's not going to be perfect, but I walk into the lecture theatre and I just deliver my talk. So sometimes it's about the mindset, sometimes it's the technological barriers, but it usually, particularly as you're gaining that confidence and you're learning to restrain your impulses to perfectionism, it is going to be more burdensome. And if you're doing complicated things in the online environment, then it can be extremely burdensome. It can also be difficult to predict some of the issues or the problems that you might have. You might develop something amazing for the students, but then it turns out that they need to be able to access a particular kind of software, or they need a particular kind of internet connection to be able to make use of it. And suddenly your beautiful curriculum doesn't work as planned. So the more you can try and anticipate those problems, the more you can avoid them. And usually that means, again, keeping things simple. The more complicated, the more novel and innovative they are, the higher the probability that something unexpected might take place. But with all of that sort of context in mind, the basic principles of online curriculum design are the same as face-to-face curriculum design. You need to have a very clear plan for what the learning objectives or outcomes are of the course or the lecture or the class. What is it that you want students to be able to do at the end of this learning experience? What knowledge or skills do you expect them to develop? And then you need to think about what learning activities will be necessary for them to develop and acquire that knowledge and skills. And then even if you don't have a formal assessment program, you need to think about how you would assess their acquisition of those skills and knowledge. I always think about when I'm giving a lecture to students, think, well, this is not necessarily something that is examinable or that they're going to be applying in their assessment, but how would I know at the end of the lecture if the students actually learned what I was hoping that they would learn? And usually that means formulating learning outcomes or objectives, like being able to explain concept X or discuss or analyze, topic Y. And therefore I can think, well, if I wanted to assess them, I'd get them to explain it out loud to me, or I'd get them to talk about it. So I have some idea of how they demonstrate the skills and knowledge. If I have learning outcomes that aren't accessible in some way or aren't demonstrable, then they're not learning outcomes. And that's okay to recognize that you can cover things that aren't necessarily going to be linked to specific learning outcomes, but you need to have some learning outcomes so that you've got some point to your teaching. So that constellation of the outcomes, the activities, and the assessment tasks need to be constantly checking that it's all aligned. When thinking about what are achievable learning outcomes or what learning activities you might need to do, you'll need to know more about what prior knowledge or skills your students might have, what experience they might have, how much time you might have for the learning activities. I'm often asked to, teach particular groups of students about the ethics of a particular field, whether it's the ethics of transplantation or it's healthcare ethics. My first question is usually, how much time do I have? Because I've either usually got an hour or I've got 10 minutes if it's a conference talk, or I might have much more time than that. But depending on how much time you've got, you really need to adjust your expectations of what you can do. And you also maybe adjust the way you're going to approach things. You might be able to teach the same learning outcomes in a different way, more efficiently, but in a way that's maybe less fun for students. So there'll be these constant trade-offs as you try to achieve the objectives of the particular activity. You need to think creatively and critically. So that means thinking critically about what you're trying to do and how you're going to do it, and think about the ways that you might be able to achieve things, even if you don't have the resources or the time or the experience that you might ideally have. One thing in particular that I wish I'd learned a lot sooner is how to make use of other people's resources. Rather than inventing everything from scratch myself using some fantastic whiz-bang technology that I have no understanding of, someone else has developed a really good YouTube video, 5-minute video explaining a particular concept. They've got a beautiful animation. Use that. Why would I try and build a kind of mediocre copy of that myself when I can actually use and share with my students a resource that I've checked, that is your outstanding quality and that's already available? And recognizing that some things that we might think are really a value add are not essential and can be left out. It's very tempting in the online environment to add more and more and more. And that's where you need to put a brake on yourself and recognize that you shouldn't overload your students. Adjust your expectations and refine your priorities as you go along, as you realize that not everything will be achievable within the constraints of your particular teaching environment. Recognize it's not going to be perfect. Particularly the first time around, there'll be a steep learning curve for you. And whether that's because of your own limitations of experience or because you're teaching to a new group of students or you're teaching a new type of thing to a group that might be familiar to you. But what you need to do is to learn from every experience that you have and then revise your curriculum. And every time you make a revision, check back and think, what are those learning outcomes? What are the learning activities? What is the assessment? And how does it line up? Think about whether the students are demonstrating the skills and knowledge that you wanted them to get. Maybe they're doing other things and that's even better. If there are things that perhaps are missing, you'll need to adjust what you do. And particularly over time, think about how you can be more efficient and more effective in what you do. That's what I think I've learned most through greater experience, is just realizing how I can invest my time more wisely. And we'll talk hopefully a little bit about that when we talk about how you might do learning activities or assessment in the online environment. So when I had this, met with Amira the other day to discuss this session, and then I came away and I thought, I've got 90 minutes. I know a little bit about the potential audience. I know a little bit about the potential goals of this session. But I immediately had to start thinking, what can we achieve? What conversations can we start in these 90 minutes today? And also I wanted to build in some flexibility so we can see what comes out of the discussions and be able to perhaps adjust what I'm doing as we go along. But I had a plan. If I didn't have a plan, this would just be me talking at you for 90 minutes. It would be incredibly boring. It's not going to be perfect, but next time I do a workshop like this, it's going to be that much better because of this experience. So that's sort of, I think that the key thing in terms of curriculum design and development is having a plan, being really clear about what you're hoping to do, and then being prepared to revise and improve it as you go along. And now I think I'm on time for some discussion questions.
Fantastic, thank you. I think you've set the stage very well. I can ask the audience to raise their hands also if they want to come on in live, but I'd like to ask one question to start off with. So when you talk about having realistic expectations online, so if this, so given that now most of us are new or uncomfortable still, even not new, I'm a year old or year and a half old, but still uncomfortable in the virtual realm. Do you think our expectations should be watered down for the same topic? So I'm teaching informed consent. My methodology would have to, of course, vary according to the web. However, should I also have fewer expectations from my students than I would have had if they were sitting in the next room face to face?
Great question. I think yes and no. If what you need is for your students to come out with an understanding of the basic principles of informed consent, to be able to apply that, for example, to particular clinical situations, that should be achievable in the online environment. But where I immediately think, in these particular times, it may be that with the constraints of the pandemic, students are more stressed, they're going to be paying less attention. Maybe some of the things that I would normally teach in addition are no longer as essential, and we need to really prioritize because we know that the students aren't going to be as interested or maybe won't have the attention span. But the way that we teach that, or the way that you might teach that, will probably change because you are going to teach it in a different way. And that might mean compromising a little bit, perhaps on some of the things that you think would ideally work better. But then sometimes we've found, surprisingly, for example, our lectures, which are delivered live online now, but they're working far better. We're finding students are interacting more by being able to interact in the chat window. So sometimes when you think it's not going to work as well, it actually can work well in different ways, if that helps.
Yeah, so that was useful. I'll take a couple of our students have raised hands. Gideon, one of our graduates from the PhD program. Go ahead, Gideon. Unmute yourself and please put your video on if at all possible so that we can see you also. And he's tuned in from Nairobi.
Thank you very much. So my question is on time for preparing and considering the objectives that you may have. Could you please elaborate it? Because you talked about having the same objectives for maybe 10 minutes and the same objectives for maybe 90 minutes. So how do you go about it? How do you achieve the objectives within the 10 minutes and still achieve the same objective in 90 minutes?
That's a very good thing to highlight. So I'm probably being a little bit misleading in that, for example, to take the example there of informed consent. So if my learning outcome is that I want the students be able to explain the core elements of informed consent. Now, I think they'd be able to do that with even a 5-minute concept where we talk through these are the 4 elements, and they'd be able to repeat them back to me, explain them in their own words. But if I had 90 minutes, I'd probably then have some additional objectives, which would be able to sort of think critically about these competencies or these elements in particular situations. So I'd probably be expanding. And so it's less about, but would they still, with the 10 minutes and the 90 minutes, are they all going to come out with, that the really essential bit about what is required for informed consent? Yes. Will the students who have the 90 minutes of thinking and discussing it in more detail, will that be better for them? Will they know more? Yes. But if really the key thing they need to come away with is the understanding of informed consent, then I have to tell myself, you know what, the 10 minutes is probably enough. Whereas there would be some things where someone says, can you teach my students X, Y, and Z? And I say, yes, but we can't do that with just 10 minutes. So it depends, I guess, on the learning outcome. So, but that you're right to call me out on that.
Great. So Faisal from Islamabad, psychiatrist and our PGD alumnus.
Thank you. My question is very basic. I mean, we're talking about the virtual teaching, so humanizing the experience, engaging the audience. So where to look in the camera while interacting?
Sort of, how do you get someone to look into the camera like I'm now doing, which I'm not doing?
As a teacher, as a facilitator, so you look on this dot on the top of your laptop, or you look into the smaller window, the person you're talking to. I mean, that's very basic, but I think very important.
It's definitely very important. So they're the types of skills that that people will develop and use depending on how they're teaching. But they're the simple things that can obviously make a big difference to people. They're not always, I think, possible. And I think it's important to recognize situations in which they're maybe not the most important thing. If you have to make choices between doing that and perhaps doing something like paying attention to incoming questions from students in a chat window. But definitely that's a key skill.
Great.
But
so I think we have someone from the CBEC room. There were like 5 people. So can you please zoom in on yourself? This is probably Bushra. Yeah,
it is. Hi, Dominic.
Zoom in on Bushra, please.
Yeah, okay. Unmute it?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, Dominic, you mentioned planning and objectives and everything. And of course, we talk of online teaching, especially now in our context because of the pandemic, right? However, I would like to think beyond the pandemic and talk about this a hybrid. Because even when we're looking at bioethics education as such, especially at an undergrad level, there isn't so much time to do everything face-to-face, right? So my question is what's your experience regarding what should or should not be done as an online component, and which aspects should be left as a face-to-face, when keeping in mind that we have the luxury of both? So just your experience on that.
I think in an ideal world, things that involve discussions with small groups would be face-to-face. But that said, in our experience with our medical students, our attendance tends to be a little bit better in the online small groups. We do feel it's harder to coax some of them to have those discussions, but I think small group teaching, which is discussion focused, ideally would be face-to-face, particularly if over time people are going to develop the bonds that make them feel more comfortable talking. But often it's going to be different constraints that will determine what you take online and what you do face-to-face.
Okay, I think another related question has come into in the chat boxes. In your opinion, should curriculum be hybrid, online and face-to-face? And if yes, then what is your experience in this area of a mixed classroom?
Usually, in my experience at university, it's going to be determined for you by factors beyond your control. So we've always had, with our face-to-face program with medical students, we've had some online resources. We try to do the flipped classroom where you say, they'll engage with the resources online, and then we have these face-to-face discussions. In reality, then you find most of the students, or at least half of the students, don't do the prep work. So you kind of, that doesn't work as effectively as it should in theory. But even, I think it's impossible to say there's one model that works, because it's going to largely depend on when and how your students prefer to interact with you. And ultimately, where you're getting the most interaction or engagement from students, that's where I think you need to invest your resources and make sure that your priority learning outcomes are being covered, because otherwise there's a very high probability they will just miss the core teaching.
Yeah, so, okay, I'll come to John in a minute, but it's related to this. Like, for instance, in a classroom, physical classroom, you've got 20 people sitting around a table. and you see someone not as engaged as you would want them to, you just walk over to them and you make eye contact, etc., which is something Faisal was also alluding to. But in a format in which you actually don't have a physical contact, you have these boxes, whether they have faces in them or not may also vary, because many people nowadays do not want their videos on for whatever reason. But how do you, is it better to have a smallest possible number online so that you can engage them personally, or as opposed to like 40, 50, 60, 70 people as we sometimes have in our classrooms?
I love that we are jumping to all of the questions about, skills for teaching online, which I haven't focused on, but so forgive me that I'm a bit off the cuff with things. I'm going to keep saying it depends, because it does depend on your student audience. With us, we find a lot of students, they don't have their video on, and there can be really important reasons why we shouldn't pressure them to have their videos on. The more we get to know the students, trying to ensure that they have the same small group teacher each time to support them, makes them feel more comfortable. The usual techniques of trying to draw out students in small group teaching, making it a non-confrontational setting, but naming them and asking if other people have anything to share, responding positively, all of that can help. But a lot of it, I think, is dependent on group dynamics. So if you've got students like our medical students who have been in small groups, the same small groups for several months, we can find a group that will be very, very interactive, and then others where clearly they have some bad dynamics and it doesn't work so well. When we then try and do that with a fresh class of students who've never met before outside of medicine, that's where we've learned it's very, very difficult, because they don't know each other. They're not very confident. You'll get the couple of really keen students who talk a lot, and then it is harder to manage those dynamics we find in the online setting. That's no easy fix to that, I think, but just good teaching principles of being supportive and being aware of it and trying to address the challenges best you can with the students you have.
Okay, I think we'll just take one more question. Dr. John Veru is our PhD alumnus and a current master's student. And one of the students, among our students, we actually make them, force them to keep their videos on. So he's got his video on right now for you.
Okay. Thank you, and thank you, Dominique, for that presentation. And I think you've partially answered the question I was to ask, or maybe you'll talk about it. Bioethics, we've always said it is a multidisciplinary kind of approach of training. But by and large, as we move on, it's becoming more and more semi-autonomous, if I might say, with very pointed trainings. Trainings for PGD, for example, for masters. You have undergraduates. But with this pointing, you also require very specific, maybe skills. You might require to have a combination. Like the classes we attend at CBEC, we have the PGDs and MBs combined together. My question to you is the challenges. You don't have enough resources. You don't have enough personnel to do all these activities, but it's developing as a very important branch in both healthcare and other aspects of life. Thank you.
So tell me if I don't answer the question that you have in mind, but if I interpret you correctly, you're thinking it's so essential that often we don't have the teaching staff, or we have students who come from a range of different backgrounds, some of whom might be highly skilled, others who you have to start from zero. And whether you've got it's resources, like you don't have the teaching staff, or you don't have much of the students time to actually teach them. That's where I think it really comes into that curriculum design step. You have to think, what do you really need the students to learn, and to make sure that you're not wasting time. Often we find, oh, actually, we've got this whole class where we're spending 10% of our teaching time teaching them something that's really interesting. Some of them really love it, but they don't actually need to know that. So the first thing, if you can plan well, cut out the stuff that isn't essential. And then, as I said before, with some of the things, if there's a topic, for example, that you don't have the skills to teach, or to teach it in a particular way, you would ideally have some other resources. Find out if it's already available online. If someone else has developed it, and there's a good video that you can check, because there's obviously some bad stuff out there on the internet. But if you can check it and say, this is really good, maybe this is a really well-established ethicist who teaches this particular, gives this particular talk, use those resources. At the beginning of my online teaching, I was an idiot. I wanted to build everything my own way because I thought it would be brilliant. And I realized there are a lot of people who are really good at what they do, And if I use what they've built, then I can spend my time doing the things where I can make a contribution that maybe no one else can. So pay attention to those resources. And if you don't know where to find them, then connect with people who will help you to get, available resources, rather than saying, oh, if you give me $500,000, I'll build you this fantastic program, because that's pie in the sky business.
Okay, great. I think we can take one final question. Anita Alana from AKU has raised her hand. So go ahead, Anita. And can you please put your video on while you're asking the question, if possible?
So I've put on my video. You all can see me, right?
No, but don't worry. Just ask your question.
Okay. I've been teaching bioethics for some time, and during this pandemic, I started teaching online. And first of all, thank you, Dominic, for this session. It is very informative as we are getting into the discussion. While we have been teaching, we've learned a lot during this pandemic. And as you said, that after looking at the objectives and at the contents, we need to enter into the pedagogies. And to my experience, if we have multiple pedagogies within a session, say by this I mean that we have a small clipping, we have a case, we have some discussion and small group, it is very possible to capture the attention of the students and keep them engaged. Because if you're planning for visual learners, for auditory learners, for all these people, and you have different things plugged in, then I find that there is a lot of engagement. They are quite good. And even those who might be, quiet in some of the parts, in some activities they come up, because there is a blend of a few activities. And as you said, I've been using resources that have been made by others. I've been using CBEX videos. So many resources that are already present, I've been utilizing those. Otherwise, it's very difficult to have so many pedagogies within one session. Thank you.
Thank you. I agree. And I think we're going to talk about that in the next section. Having different kinds of modalities for learning for the students, is that way you have something for everyone, ideally.
So I think we've had a good discussion for this first segment. Why don't we move on, Dominique, to your next segment?
Okay. All right. So the learning activities then, which of course I think everyone is keen to focus on, and I wouldn't discourage you from thinking about those learning activities. They're obviously the main part of the meal that you're going to be providing your students. But I think as teachers, often we do jump straight to thinking, how am I going to teach and what am I going to teach, rather than putting that in the context of what do the students need to learn. And particularly with online teaching being fairly labor intensive and also challenging in terms of engaging your students, the more planning that you can do before you get really immersed in the how you teach and the activities that you're teaching, I think is important. And this is, I guess, your mileage may vary, as they say. Some people will have a brilliant technological setup. You might establish some really elaborate simulation animations online, and that will be fantastic. But for most of us, particularly those of us who haven't come with a computer background, perhaps, your average teacher is going to struggle with all of those, high fancy things. Starting simple is important, not only because it avoids perhaps the loss of time that happens when all of the fancy stuff doesn't work, but actually what we've found is your average student seems to really appreciate just high quality, basic materials that enable them to learn as efficiently as possible. And yes, you'll have some great feedback and you'll impress your audience if you go to a teaching and learning conference and you show them this elaborate app maybe that you made. At the end of the day, for your students, they just want to be able to come to class, whether that's online or face-to-face, and do their learning as easily as possible. And so investing your time in having an infrastructure that works, that is easy for students to navigate, and then provides them as easily as possible with high quality but simple core focused learning is usually what is going to have a bigger impact in terms of both the learning and student satisfaction. I've already, I think, touched on some of the tips on the screen there, but a temptation we have, I think, with online teaching is to add extra things. If someone says you've got 10 lectures this semester, you think, well, I've got 10 times 1 hour and this is what I can deliver in that time frame. And you're sort of constrained by the time. But if you give someone a lovely online platform, you can just keep adding more and more and more. You can add more of these fantastic resources that you've found other people have developed, for example. And students don't necessarily like that. Not only will they not engage if they don't have the time, but some of them will feel overwhelmed and they will struggle to try and work out what they need to focus on if you're laden your website, with all of this extra learning. So just as you wouldn't try and cram even more into the 10 hours of lecture time that you have, you've got to work out how much time you actually expect students to spend in their online learning and constrain what you put in accordingly. So just because you can, and just because you think it's going to be an amazing learning activity, doesn't necessarily mean that you should. So trying to be clear with students about what is core learning and then what are perhaps the fantastic, fun, optional things that they can do, I think is really quite important. So if you're about to teach online for the first time or you're building a new online course, start with what you know, rather than jumping to this, the best technology that you just saw or the wonderful example that someone else has used. Think about what you're comfortable with, what your teaching staff are already able to do. So that means lectures, seminars, workshops, discussions, all of those things can go very quickly online. You can just deliver it synchronously, like we're doing now with a live Zoom session. So when people say, oh, the lecture was really difficult because I had to give it online, if you're just going to give the same lecture you would give in a lecture theatre via Zoom, then it really shouldn't cost anyone any extra time. Of course, you might want to make a lecture into a series of shorter video modules. You might need to build in different ways of having discussions with students if you're going to have pre-recorded things. But at the very simplest level, you can just do all of your face-to-face teaching in a Zoom live environment. And sometimes that actually will work a lot more effectively than perhaps developing and recording something that might be very labor intensive and then students don't engage with. Students tend to enjoy the things where they're able to interact with you live the most, at least in my experience. But some of the other things that you do when students are learning face-to-face, you have assessment activities. We know they learn through assessment, and you might have quizzes, you might get them to reflect on cases in writing. All of those things you can deliver online, but you need to work out what of those activities you'll keep, what won't work as well, as I think we already discussed, if it's, say, asynchronous, so discussions, something that really don't seem to work asynchronously, whereas if you have students actually talking live with you or with one another, you're going to get more of a real discussion going. So that is going to depend in part, again, on your students, how keen they are, on what it is that you want them to get out of particular activities. Thinking about what will be most effective for their learning, and also what is likely to engage them. With a lot of students, if all they have to do is show up on campus and be present, once they're in the room, obviously you still want to keep them enjoying it, you want to keep them engaged so that they'll come back to class next week. But most people are kind of happy to be physically present. But in an online environment, if you're not doing live things, then you're dependent on the student making a choice in their own free time without perhaps any program saying at 9 o'clock, you've got to be here for this class. They're going to have to be motivated to open their computer, to go online and to go to wherever it is that they're doing this online learning. And that does mean that engagement is potentially tricky. Some of the things that we used to spend, we're spending less time now because we found they weren't working, but we used to spend a lot of time on, and I think that we're perhaps as teachers often encouraged a little bit too much to do, is to think about developing all sorts of fun activities like quizzes and stuff, animations, for example, in videos. They cost a lot of time and they look fantastic and students love them when you do them. But often the amount of time you will have to spend developing those things versus the actual impact they have is really very disappointing. The time it will take you to develop a really sophisticated looking quiz versus the time that you could ask students those quiz questions in a live Zoom session, you're likely to get, in my experience again, you're likely to get better engagement with a live quiz discussion with the students. And that way you learn, okay, well, I'm not going to spend hours of my life developing all of these, online activities in future. Of course, if you have different results, then you may say we're going to build into these quizzes, every week for the next 12 years. So think about what works, but when you're doing it for the first time, don't overinvest in case it doesn't work. Someone already mentioned hybrid teaching. I think one of the challenges, if you've got sort of a cohort where you might have some students doing some classes on campus and doing some things online, is that you need to always be catering to all of your students. You need to make sure that students who can't attend the live activities will have the same effective quality of learning experiences as the students who do. And that can sometimes create concerns about equity. It also can create sometimes a double burden. We have one of our subjects that we teach outside of pandemic times where students can choose to be on the cloud campus online, whereas others come to a physical class. And that, to a large extent, means a duplication of work for us. There's reasons why that's done from the university perspective, but it's not a very efficient way to teach. And it does seem to have a lot of the disadvantages of sort of online teaching without the benefits that we have when we just teach online. Think about what will happen if students don't engage in activities. A common thing that we're encouraged to do is to get students participating in discussions in the online environment. I personally think at my current university that our discussion boards are not well designed to really support that engagement, but even at different institutions where I think they've been a little bit more engaging, I've never seen really great student engagement in discussion boards. It occasionally happens. You'll have a small group of students where there are a handful of them who are really keen. They'll go back and forth chatting and the staff are ecstatic. We think it's all amazing. But on a general basis, we see the students posting on the discussion boards only if it's mandated through assessment, which is what you really have to do if you really need them to do that for their learning, or if they're posting to let you know there's a problem with an online resource. So it's more of a, how do we fix this technology issue than something that can really replicate the discussions that you might have in class. With our medical students, as I said before, we have live lectures that are recorded. When we used to teach on campus before the pandemic, we also had recordings of the lectures. Interestingly, we find we have a better turnout for the sessions online when they're live. About 50% of students consistently will show up than we usually would have in terms of the proportion of students who would actually attend those classes live on campus. And we think that's because of the convenience for them of learning and just showing up to a session, from their bedroom or their kitchen. We also have our small group teaching that we do live on Zoom, and then we have a range of online modules, and as I mentioned, the discussion board. All of this, of course, is because we have a big program in our medical course for students for ethics, law, and professionalism. So if you're only teaching a couple of classes, then this wouldn't be the way that you would structure it, obviously. But what we have is an online view for them where they can see what classes are happening, what the learning outcomes are, what the readings are that we recommend that they reread. Consistently, they tend not to. And then they can actually click on a link to go to a live Zoom session, which then, of course, a recording is later posted. They also have access to online modules. Here's an example of something that we're using other people's resource. Queensland University of Technology has developed an end-of-life care for clinicians legal course that has been rolled out for medical practitioners and students around the country, a series of 10 online modules. And they do it so well, and they've got world-class expertise that we've now just made that part of our core curriculum, but we need to have something in our online learning environment to direct students towards it and to make sure that it fits within our curriculum so that they're not overloaded. So we didn't just say, oh, you have to complete this other course. We have, each week where we expect them to complete one of the modules in that external course. So we still kind of contextualize it as part of our learning. We might then have something that we develop ourselves. So this year I had to quickly develop something about the ethics of deceased donation because we had a lecture space that we lost. And so we put learning outcomes, an explanation of some core things, some links to further reading if they're interested, and a short little video of a Canadian expert talking about the dead donor rule in about 3 minutes that gave it a bit of vibrancy and real value. This was something that I could develop in about an hour, partly because this is an area that I'm quite familiar with, but something that was relatively low cost, but has proven very popular with the students because they can get all the information they need about this topic from just going to this one page. So it's simple, but it's something that's efficient and achieves the learning outcomes. This is just to give you a feel for what our discussion board looks like. The blacked out names are students, and you can see they generally tend to post when there's a problem with, a technology, a module isn't working. With some exceptions, there's maybe a couple of students out of 150 in a cohort who will post kind of regularly with some interesting reflections on cases. But this is something that after 9 years in the business, I still have not worked out the secret to getting students to engage online. Our students do tell us, our medical students, that they have quite a lot of discussions in their student Facebook group, but for ethical and legal reasons, we can't participate with them on Facebook. So we try to constrain them to work in an online environment that is actually not their preference. And unsurprisingly, we see that they don't engage. So simple is something that I've learned is the best way to start. Once you get the basics nailed simply, then you can build and you can expand, and you find you've got extra time. You can build things that are more complicated. You can test new innovations, but start with what you know and start with those core learning outcomes being delivered as simply as possible. Students appreciate consistency. So having even just things like having a similar format to the way we structure our modules, a consistency of color and font, which might seem kind of obvious, but not always something that we invested the time in until we realized that students really liked it. They like what is familiar. They like patterns, particularly I think in an online environment where, as I said, they're sort of dependent on their own motivation to engage. Having something that really gets them into some kind of a routine is helpful. Ease of navigation is critical. The first time we developed a new subject a few years ago, we spent an awful lot of time trying to develop really great resources. And at the end of the semester, we found that very few students had engaged with a whole bunch of these resources. And feedback, this is anecdotal, but from some students was, oh, we had to click on a lot of buttons to get to the resource. So, we just stuck with the main page. The more effort they have to put in, the more clicks they have to click on to actually get through to a particular piece of information, you're going to lose students at every click. So regardless of how your system is set up, having something that students can easily find what they need to do and that they can navigate along, and they'll be guided along all of the things that you want them to engage with, that is the best investment of your time. Once you've sorted that out, you can worry about everything else. But if they can't find it easily, they won't use it. It doesn't matter if it's the best resource in the world. As I think Annika said earlier, having smaller digestible chunks of learning works better, usually speaking, in the online environment. If you're not delivering it live, don't have a 1 hour recording of yourself talking, have 5 or 10 minute videos broken up, a little bit of variety, not too much variety so that it looks messy and they get lost, but having some diversity, even if it's just a little change each week, something fresh that keeps their interest. So this is what an applied ethics unit that we have looks like. We've tried to keep consistency each week. We start with, here are the learning outcomes. We have 3 basic teaching short videos, and then we have further resources, and we have an activity, which is usually, discuss this case. So it's very simple, but it's the consistency of it. So you can see in sort of the following week, genomics, again, the same kind of format. It's different teachers delivering this, but we've got the same style across each week. And that seems to assist with engagement and an appreciation from the students. These are not particularly complex videos. They're just narrated PowerPoints. So they're relatively easy to develop, but just investing that time in getting a template and using it consistently has really paid off for us. Keep in mind that what works for some students isn't going to work for others. Don't respond really too quickly. Don't be reactive in response to student feedback. One student will hate something. It turns out the silent majority maybe really appreciates. What works for some staff also won't work for others. Some staff have different skills. They maybe establish a better bond with students, so they're going to be more effective with some things. So there will be elements that you just can't control, but be aware of that, be mindful, and don't expect things to always work the same way with different people involved. But the best thing that you can do with your online teaching and your learning activities anything that gets the students engaged, that gets them active, and that really fosters a sense of engagement. You can get that out of a live class because the students kind of feel the vibe in the room. They know that other students are interested, are talking. In the online environment, it can be as silent as the grave. And that's where trying to get some of the discussion board activity happening can be difficult, but you need to keep working at it. Even if you're posting a message every week, hi, how's it going? This is what's happening. You might feel a little bit silly when no students respond, but we've learned that a lot of students later say, oh, I really like those check-ins. And we think, why didn't you ever, post back or answer a question? But they're actually listening and they're hearing. You just can't see them in the online environment. So keep doing it though. If you disengage, that's when it's dead and that's when it's over.
Wow, great session for
like I'm being really negative.
No, you're actually being very practical because much of this is what we experience also, especially in the area of engagement. That it's the struggle to engage students online. One of the ways we do it is smaller classes and keeping their videos on all the time, which many people would prefer not to, but that at least makes sure that the person is sitting in front of you, at least there, and not cooking a meal or driving a car. So that's one thing. So one thing that is very clear, Dominique, you're coming from, again, a university which is already invested in the online domain as well as the physical domain, but also on the online, and it predates the pandemic. So you have a structure and you have a system. We've all migrated into this, and we are all very reluctant migrants into the virtual domain, which is why the infrastructure is often lacking. We've had to start off with things like getting enough broadband to be able to do a video conference. And of course, our IT has been what we can do ourselves. And then we've taught our IT people to do what we can do. So your level of comfort is something that we can hope to get at some point. But a university buy-in is very important, and institutional buy-in is very important, which is generally lacking for us at this point because the investment has always been only in the physical domain. So that was just a comment that I wanted to make. One thing that I wanted to also talk about before I go to the questions, and people can raise their hands so that we can take your questions now. The one question that I wanted to ask was, so while giving a session, for instance, there's also the chat box open, and students can start a discussion in the chat box parallel to the facilitator, the teacher. So we've found that kind of distracting for the students, because students will be reading the chat box and talking to each other, which may be completely relevant or maybe completely irrelevant to the talk that the teacher has made after hours of work. So we've actually disable the chat and ask the students to ask questions to each other and to us. But have you been able to master this act of handling their chat as well as your questions?
So this is controversial within my team, in the sense that some of my colleagues have really strong feelings, just like you've expressed. They find it distracting. They either go off on a tangent in responding, or they find it disrespectful. I personally love it. And the reason why I love it is because in a normal lecture environment, if their hands go up, I stop what I'm doing, not always, but when I'm ready, and I say, oh, what's your question? And then if they've got a question or a comment and it's really irrelevant, then the whole thing's been derailed, because I have to treat it respectfully. And what I like about the chat window is I can see it and think, oh, I'm going to ignore that one, and I'm going to take the one that's relevant. But I completely understand that. I have colleagues who say, no, it's incredibly distracting. And you're right that sometimes you do see, oh, wow, now there's this whole conversation happening that they're really not paying attention to me. I still think, to me, that's preferable, because what they used to do is I'd see the two people up in the back row talking and I wouldn't know what they're talking about. And I had, limited control over that. So that was always a risk with the live teaching. I think that's where I'd say it's going to depend on the teacher, but definitely saying, look, if you're happy, I'm happy for them to put their questions there, but make sure that it is, on topic, don't get distracted, and see what happens. Because if you say, look, we're not going to do it, and at the end of the class, you find you've only got 4 questions because by then people have forgotten their questions, then maybe you've traded it off, and maybe you need to then think, okay, well, how can I get more comfortable with keeping my eye on that chat window? So working out what works for you with your students and recognizing that maybe people will have a different approach is all I can, that's what we've decided with my team. So
fair enough, yeah. So I think Fasiha is our PhD alumnus, physician at Deakin University in Karachi.
Hello, Dr. Dominique. How are you?
good, thank you.
It was an amazing session. Enjoying it a lot. Okay, I just want to, I have a comment. I just wanted to say one thing. What I've experienced in this last 1.5 year in teaching ethics online, we are doing hybrid model. What I think is that the recorded lectures, as far as what I have experienced, is not a good modality of teaching ethics, the recorded lectures. Interactive lectures online, live, better, but somehow the other, it doesn't have that spark and the thing that you need in ethics teaching. That's what I think. You can reflect on it. And the other thing that the Dr. Ahmed and you were discussing, that it's very difficult for the student to, for the lecturer or the teacher to actually see how involved the audience is. And what I think is it drives a very negative thoughts in your mind. You don't feel good when your student, is not interested in it. But the way that I went and the thing that I experienced and managed, or what I thought was that just focus on the people who are listening. That's what I do. I just want you to reflect on one thing, that don't you think that the most important thing is that the topic of ethics that you've been teaching to the student and the modality or the tool that you're using for teaching should be in sync. That is the biggest challenge of teaching ethics. For example, if I'm teaching principalism, I can go for a lecture, I can go for a presentation, interactive presentation. But when I talk about ethical dilemma, I would like to have a small group interactive session. So I think the most challenging thing for a teacher is to learn and understand the topic that he or she is teaching and the modality or the tool that he or she is teaching. For me, the greatest challenge is the assessment of the topic that I'm teaching in this hybrid thing. So I just like you to comment on it.
Thank you. Well, the next section will be on, the final section will be on the assessment, so I might defer that to then. But in terms of, I think working out what you teach in particular modalities really will depend on what you're trying to teach. I used to think, oh, it would be best for me to give my whole lecture because this topic was really important, so I'd record a whole lecture if I had to record it. But then by forcing myself to think, well, actually make smaller videos, I find I can produce a much better, if I take the time to do it, a much better 5-minute concept explanation, and then have a separate section, where we maybe have a live discussion of applying that in a particular context. And it made me realize how much time I sometimes lose in my classics lectures because I'm waffling on about a concept which I really could have summed up much more succinctly. So thinking though about what it is that you want them to learn from something, I think enables you to better, if you're thinking about critical analysis or discussion, that's something where you're leaning towards much more of a live interaction. Whereas if you're talking about know the elements of this or identify X, Y, and Z or explain concept, that's something where you can say, look, this is maybe more passive learning where I can present them with a video or give them a reading. Something that is more applied, I think definitely the more you're going to need an interaction for what that's worth.
Okay, we have Dr. Inayatullah Memon from Nawabshah, I believe. He's a PhD alumnus from our program and also a master's in bioethics from the very first batch of Aga Khan University. So Dr. Memon. You have to unmute yourself, sir.
Are you listening now? Thank you very much, Dr. Dominique, for your excellent presentation. It was very effective. It is actually very much informative. And I mean, for people like us where the virtual learning or online learning is in infancy. But I have one question, that one thing is that it was not our choice to go on virtual learning or online learning, but it is because of the current pandemic. But there are some features which make it less effective than the face-to-face learning, particularly in bioethics teaching. When we are teaching by face-to-face mode of the learning, then there is a direct communication. One is the eye contact, which is not seen in the virtual learning or and online teaching. Number two is there are some of the gestures of the teacher and the students, which are the non-verbal communication, and which are one of the excellent communication in between the teachers and the students, which are absent in online learning. Can you comment on these, please? Thank you.
Thank you. I agree completely. There are many contexts, and communication is, I think, a classic one where it's going to be very different in the online environment. I think sometimes we may exaggerate or we may overestimate the impact of the online environment. For many students nowadays, for many doctors, for example, nowadays, they're holding clinics online in telehealth. So it may be an opportunity to say, how can we support and foster communication skills in an online environment, recognizing there'll be some elements different, but there may be new important skills that students need to learn. But also acknowledging that if, what you really need to do with a particular interaction is to have some kind of physical presence, then thinking, well, we can't teach that online. When and how are we going to teach it? So recognizing the limits, I think, is definitely very important, but also sometimes thinking maybe we can, or maybe things will work out better. For example, we thought that some of our teaching we wouldn't get the interactivity in the online discussions. For example, in the lectures, we thought it's just no one will even show up. And yet we've found it's actually been very effective with the students. And we speculate it's because for many of the students, this is how they often interact now on social media, and they're used to interacting with screens. So stuff that for us older people, we think, oh, this is terrible. Maybe for the students, this is actually more aligned with the way that they are accustomed to learning. So when we see their performance on assessment, of course, that's what tells us, if we've designed the assessment well, that's what tells us if they're learning what we need them to learn. And that's what can guide us if we think they're not learning certain skills. But maybe it turns out, again, what we've found is that where we think we've had a big difference in terms of how we've taught or the quality of teaching, and the achievement of the learning outcomes has been the same. So actually, you can deliver the basics, I think, in a lot of different ways, and it doesn't necessarily have that big of an impact in some areas on their skills development. But communication, I agree, very, very specific, I think.
Okay, so Dr. Mehman, you have a follow-up question for that, or should we?
Yes, I have another question which is related to that how can we assess the professionalism, part of the ethics by online method? Are there any important tools which have now been invented for the assessment of the professionalism and other features which are, the better assessed by face-by-face assessment, for example, observation and other things? Thank you.
I think for interactions with patients in terms of professionalism, the evidence really is that workplace-based assessments, so in that clinical environment, observing what people do and how they do it is the most authentic form of assessment. But that said, if someone's interacting with a patient in a telehealth encounter and you can observe what they're doing in the same way we can observe the way people are interacting in this session, then there will be important opportunities to say, oh, this person who kept interrupting, or the person who didn't remember to put their microphone off, those are little elements of professionalism that are also important. And certainly with our students in the online teaching environment, we preface, for example, our seminars with the same advice that we would give them in a live seminar. You need to be respectful. You need to give other people the opportunity to speak. And they're important. We do see with some students concerning signs of lack of professionalism, where they don't say thank a staff member who's responded to a question, or where they've kind of made a rude comment online. And that's an opportunity to say, just because this is an online environment, you still need to be respectful. So sometimes we actually have an opportunity to see the unprofessionalism that maybe is going on behind the scenes in real life that we don't observe. So I agree, you can't assess all aspects of professionalism online, but there are still important opportunities to assess it or observe it and give feedback.
Great. So I think we have someone from our CBEC group wanting to ask a question. Please go ahead, and in case you can zoom in on yourself so that we know who it is.
Yeah, it's me, Swaleha. I just have, in terms of your experience, I mean, you're teaching medical students who are probably with you for a longer duration. But my question is more specific towards, so for example, if you're doing an online workshop where you have a set of participants for only a couple of days, maybe 1 or 2 days. So how do you actually build, that communication with them in order for them to actually engage in small group discussions, for instance, and you have a larger number of participants, so it's actually difficult to kind of engage with them online. And a follow-up question connected to this is, how do you handle a complicated topic online with workshop participants? Because you really don't want to be restricted to really basic concepts. You really want to go beyond at some point, because I mean, considering that we may be in the pandemic for a while, online is the only way for us to actually be engaging and opening ourselves for workshops, etc. Yeah. So yeah.
So when you have a limited time, I think you need to be really acutely mindful that every opportunity that you have to interact with them counts. And so that's right from before you actually meet them when the course starts, to the way you're communicating with them via email, when you give notice to them, that you're signaling to them then how engaged you are and what your expectations are. And then from that first moment that you have them there as students, doing your breaking the ice activities, but getting right onto it. And if there are problems, you notice after the first 2-hour session, there's been 3 students who just haven't said anything. You can't afford to wait till the next day to find out what the issue is. That's where you maybe need to reach out privately and say, is there a technology problem, or try and sort out issues sooner rather than later. But again, if you've got that intense environment, it also has some advantages, because students are going to be invested. They've consolidated and committed these 2 days to that activity. Whereas with our students who take a trimester course, they have 11 weeks, they're studying other things, and we have to get them motivated every week, ideally, to check in and do a couple of hours of learning. And I'd argue that that's actually probably more difficult to attract and keep their attention during that period than if they've actually said, here I am for a couple of days, I'm interested. So I think that's my quick response to the first question. And I'm just trying to remember the second part of the question, which was important. Sorry, if you can refresh my memory.
So if you're teaching an advanced topic, right? So I mean, because
yes, sorry. Thank you. Yeah.
Your initial thing, and you really want to teach some advanced topics, and you have a diverse audience. How do you engage with that online?
I would say the same approach that you would take to dealing with it face-to-face. There's the challenge if you're dealing, say, with a particularly sensitive topic, that the barriers to nonverbal communication, you might be less attuned to the fact that someone in the audience on Zoom, if you're not paying attention to all the pictures on the screen, or if people don't have their video on, you might not realize that a student is distressed, for example. But then you also don't necessarily know that in a real, face-to-face classroom environment either. So it's about putting this, the ground rules in place, setting the expectations, but I wouldn't be afraid to deal with a more complex topic. We haven't found difficulties with our medical students, at least in doing that. It's the only barrier is that, that lack of visual engagement sometimes with the videos, and maybe that we're more at risk of missing a student who's having a particular concern. But I think you can have those discussions, but you need to think of the principles that you would apply to teaching that face-to-face, and just think what you might need to pay extra attention to, or what you might need to allow for in the online environment that might be different. And you might have additional tools there. Some of our students seem to be more comfortable online because they feel there's less pressure when they're silent. They can post something in the chat window that they wouldn't have felt comfortable with saying out loud, because their adrenaline rush and their voice gets quavery, and so there's pros and cons.
So great. I think we can take one more question for this particular segment before we move on, and that's Dr. Stephen Mahudia from Nairobi. He's a pediatrician and a bioethicist and one of our alumni.
Yes, thank you very much. I wanted to ask about the role of giving materials to read before the session. Is there a role for that, and in which situation does it work best? Thank you.
If I had the answer to this question, it's a perennial question. It's something that I think it is important, particularly, if you've got limited time with students, or if you've got a mixed audience where there are students who come with less knowledge than others, then I think it's absolutely essential that you have some pre-reading resources. My sort of learning, maybe from experience, is to really be clear about what resources they need and to be more careful in the selection of the resources. I used to be very scattergun. Oh, here are all these great papers about this topic. If students have limited time, you really need to let them know which is the one out of these 3 papers that they really must read. And something that I've learned as I've been teaching more students who've come with no experience of ethics and no clinical experience is to really think about a resource that will be tailored to their academic background or their lack of academic background, because sometimes keen students have said, I spent hours trying to understand this paper and, I felt embarrassed. It hadn't occurred to me how much of a struggle it might have been for them. So choosing really carefully and communicating a little bit of text around them about why it's important, what you want them to get out of it, I think that increases the chances that some of the students will engage with them. But in that actual live class environment, I always go in now with the assumption that at least a significant proportion of students will not have engaged with the pre-reading. And I need to either adjust my expectations, or I need to not build, say, an activity that will be totally dependent on them having read the resource. Because if everything's dependent on that and then they haven't, then you have a disaster. So it doesn't mean that you can't have some expectations. Some of them will be a little bit more confused if they haven't done the pre-reading, but don't build a kind of centerpiece of your learning activity on the hope that everyone will do what you've asked them to do, because they'll disappoint you every time. And I just don't know how to fix that.
I think that's a very reasonable approach, Dominique. I think we have to move to the next because we may be slightly running late. We are definitely running late, but we need to move on. And for the interest of the audience, Dr. Martin has actually agreed to stay on a little bit longer than if necessary for your question. So Dominique, the third segment.
Thank you. All right, so I think assessment might be a little bit quicker. Only 2 key tips. One is that the less you have live interactions with your students, the less you're going to feel comfortable that you know them, and probably the less confident you will be, not only in terms of their final performance, say on assessment, where you might think, I haven't met Dominique, all semester, and now she's submitted this fantastic piece of work. Is it really her work? That's not the only concern. The concern is that throughout the period of time that you're teaching them, if this is, something longer than a couple of days, if you're not having those live interactions, you also have no idea how Dominique is going. You don't know if I'm really struggling. You don't have the feedback that you get from having conversations maybe once a week or seeing every few weeks in a lecture and seeing that I'm showing up to class, whether or not I'm asking questions. So that's what can be difficult, I think, about assessment, both formal assessment and sort of formative assessment in terms of monitoring how your students are learning throughout a course. The other thing is to keep in mind that, as we often hear, assessment drives learning. Increasingly, I think students are studying because they have to or because they need to for some reason, not because they necessarily have a particular love of learning or a particular interest in learning ethics. Even if they really do, they're going to have competing demands on their time, whether that's the demands of dealing with a global pandemic or their personal jobs, their personal lives. Lots of things mean that for the students, they're trying to be strategic and they're going to focus in on assessment to guide their learning because they want to pass. Often there's a financial cost associated with study, but passing the assessment is going to be a key motivation for them. And because in the online environment, usually students have a lot of the learning materials and resources available to them from the beginning, and even if that's sort of being released on, say, a weekly basis, students are in a position to pick and choose what they engage with. That's different from when they're expected to show up for 2 days of class or even just to show up for a regular live class. So they really will be very strategic about which resources will I actually engage with And in our experience, they will really hone in on the ones that help them to do assessment. Most devastatingly, in a couple of units, you'll see with some students, the only things they've looked at have been the information about the assessment, and they haven't looked at any of the learning materials at all. So the assessment, I think, is particularly influential in driving their learning in that online environment, because they're able to pick and choose what they engage with, and they will prioritize the things that they think are necessary or useful for their assessment. So that means that when you're choosing your assessment, you really need to think about the way that assessment can optimize their participation or how that might influence their engagement. The types of things that you can do will be all of the same kinds of assessment that you would do if you were teaching face-to-face. They might be writing essays, written reports, they might be analyzing cases, doing quizzes, doing tests. They might be doing presentations, which they can do live via Zoom, or they can do recorded presentations. The only thing that I think is really distinctly different is going to be a discussion. So if you've got an assessment task already, or you'd like to have an assessment task where you assess them somehow on their contributions to a discussion, that's where you'll have to choose whether you're going to get them to do that live, and how you would evaluate that, and the barriers perhaps to assessing that effectively in, say, a Zoom live discussion, or what you're going to get them to do in terms of writing things down on a discussion board. In our experience, getting them to write things down on a discussion board turns very, very easily into mini essays, rather than the kind of natural discussions that we would much rather see them doing in a live discussion. So thinking the usual things that you would be thinking about your assessment design, the timing of your assessment, whether you're going to have sort of regular small stakes discussions to try and keep them engaged. That can be burdensome for staff to be marking regularly. And we learned through experience with one of our applied ethics units, what we thought would make it easier for students, giving them a little case discussion each week. Students reported back they found that really stressful. Even though it was really low impact on their marks, they said, I had to think about assessment every week, and it really stressed me out. Thinking about the integrity of assessment, so your plagiarism checks, which we already had, I think, before going online, we had concerns about plagiarism. If you are going to evaluate students in some kind of a live interaction, you may be more concerned about verifying their identity. Efficacy in terms of how well your assessment task might evaluate a particular learning outcome. And sometimes the quality of your assessment in terms of this will really help us to assess their performance of this particular skill. Designing your assessment task to achieve that goal means it's not going to work so well for your other goal of perhaps trying to drive their engagement with the learning resources. And that's where you need to sometimes compromise or consider the trade-offs between keeping them engaged versus actually having an assessment task that determines whether they can do what you want them to be able to do. And thinking about the burdens that you're going to have in marking assessment, but I think that's probably going to be very, very similar to any burdens that you would have in a normal assessment environment. One thing we learned thanks to the pandemic, where our new kind of addition to the medical program, a final year, we're all set to have our first student conference, and we had to take it online last year. It actually turned out to be very successful. And one thing that particularly struck me about this was that one of the key components of this final year medical program assessment was that we wanted them to do a conference presentation. With previous year levels, we've got students to do a video presentation. Students didn't like doing it, even when they did it well, but it was very much an assessment task. They'd record a video, submit it to the online assessment platform, and we'd mark it. And it was very dry. And we always felt it was very sad that some of them did some really great videos and nothing ever happened with it. With this conference going online last year, we built a very, very basic website because our entire budget for the conference was taken away. And we kept it really, really simple. Students did the same kinds of video talks that they would have done in previous years in assessment, but by building it into a conference type structure, as you can see here on the screen, there was a program and people could click on it to go to individual pages where there was the talk and an abstract and the name. The students loved it. They could see everyone else's work, and it was really successful for something that was exceedingly low tech, very low resource, apart from the burdens of uploading all these videos into the site. But what I think made the difference there, it wasn't that there was anything particularly novel about this assessment activity, but we were able to put it in a context that made it interesting and engaging for the students. And it wasn't, again, it wasn't whiz bang, it wasn't high tech, but we've done that again this year. Again, it's worked really well. So sometimes really small, simple things that you can do will enhance the experience for students in ways that you won't necessarily anticipate. So it's taught us to think about not necessarily the assessment task changing, but the way we frame it and position it in the course can make a really big difference to engagement. And that's really very, very simple on the assessment front.
Great. I think, again, since we've all migrated into the virtual realm, our assessment also became a challenge for our postgraduate diploma and master's students, etc. So in the past, we used to have assessments at the end of the year, which were essays and which were I mean, quite an archaic sort of system of doing stuff, but we were doing that. They were like long, handwritten mostly, or sometimes on the computer. They were given this choice. Into the pandemic, we had to rethink ourselves and reinvent our assessment methodologies into shorter bursts of assessments over the entire span. So we'll be doing, for instance, multiple choice questions, short essay questions. We were not comfortable in that. So while some of us are trained in medical education, etc., and we're doing it in clinical and other non-clinical areas, but in bioethics, we actually had to develop our own bank. We have to fight over each question, and it is extremely labor intensive. But after all that discussion and putting in that those enormous number of hours, we come up with a product which actually does work. So we would give them the question, and that seems to work. This is the kind of exercise that we've been doing on ourselves. The test may be just an hour long for the students, but it takes huge number of hours to come to that position that we could be able to deliver that quiz or the MCQs or the short essay questions. We are in the same process doing this with our colleagues in Nairobi right now, building capacity again of our faculty over there to have a question bank for this kind of thing. So I think we are all reinventing the wheel. I see Dr. Bukusi has raised her hand, so perhaps we could have her comment and then you can respond. Dr. Bukusi.
Thank you very much. That was really, really good. My question is really simple because I'm not sure that I heard this clearly at the beginning when you started talking. What kind of students are we talking about? Because I've heard you, I mean, it's really been an excellent presentation, but I'm not clear whether there's a differentiation between whether one is teaching undergraduates, postgraduate, masters, or PhD level students. So I'm just wondering, what do you differentiate between the different levels of teaching, training?
So we teach medical students across years 1 to 4 of a postgraduate course, and we teach first year university students in an applied ethics unit. We teach postgraduate master's students who are drawn from a range of backgrounds in a health law and ethics unit. And we've also, and I would say that everything that I've touched on here would also apply when I've run short courses, for example, or you're in a small workshop session with clinicians. So I think all of this really applies across the board, but what you have to do, regardless of the level of your students, is tailor it to their specific goals and needs and the skills that they're bringing. But the actual resources that you might use, the way you might approach the teaching, I think is going to be pretty similar. The difference, if you have really sophisticated high-level, say, clinicians who have studied bioethics before, the expectations you would have of them would be different. And you might feel more confident, for example, that they're going to enthusiastically respond to a case discussion in a way that your first-year undergraduates are definitely not going to do because they'll lack the confidence and the knowledge. But the same principles and the same approach to it, I would suggest, are going to be pretty identical across the course. But I mean, I'm sure people might disagree with that. So.
Great. So I didn't introduce Dr. Bukusi to you, Dominique. She is directing the CBEC Emory Bioethics Training Initiative in Nairobi, and they've gone online for the past 2 years. They're very, very comfortable in the online domain, much more comfortable than us in Karachi, and we're learning their experience also. So I have another hand raised from the CBEC group in the room next door.
So it my question kind of ties in with what Dr. Bukusi was talking about. And so it's more generic when we are addressing, or we want to do like a faculty development workshop or something to build your own resource. So the approach in adult learning, as far as, let's say, specifically through the lens of faculty development or in the form of workshops that are conducted, I mean, what would your experience? I mean, the principle of teaching doesn't change. However, what would your experience say in some different strategies that you've used and found those more effective? And what is your opinion regarding the fact that if you're doing a workshop, should it have an assessment at the end of it or not? So just your reflection on these two areas, please.
I think we tend to increase the complexity of things when we have more experienced students, both to keep them interested and because we feel they're more capable. So with less experienced students, we'd certainly start with more basic concepts, more tasks that wouldn't put them in a position where they might feel sort of exposed or, unfamiliar. That's what I find teaching ethics. People who lack confidence and who are more junior will find it quite confronting in some cases, not all cases. And so having an environment and having the kinds of activities that are going to be supportive and encouraging to those students, I think is something you maybe need to worry about more with those kinds of students. But more experienced students can also sometimes run into the same difficulties. In terms of the principles of teaching, obviously, the more experienced your students, probably the more applied you're going to expect them to be. We see our learning outcomes change across our medical program from things like describe and explain to critically evaluate, etc. So I think the famous Bloom's taxonomy in terms of your learning outcomes will progress. But even at the junior levels, we still expect students to be able to apply and deal with quite complex topics. And often they surprise us, I think, and can do more than perhaps we might normally expect of them. And I'm probably not answering all of the questions there because you've I think that was a multi-part question. So apologies, I've forgotten the last bit.
So that's fine. We have a question from Dr. Sarosh Salim. Dr. Sarosh, would you like to come online to ask your question? Dr. Sarosh directs a postgraduate diploma in bioethics program in Lahore. If you want
hi, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Amir. I'm sorry I joined in late, but thank you so much for that. That was very interesting. I believe I heard most part of the assessments, and I think we're doing most of these things already in our program. I had just a quick small question, and that's how do we ensure that these online discussions, kind of remain discussions? Because as you said, and that's what is often happens is that they become sort of mini essays, and I know that's even a good thing, but we kind of want to keep them as discussions, and so that it's a different level of learning for all of us involved. So I mean, just some suggestion or guidance on how do we ensure that they remain discussions and small comments and discussions, and people keep answering to those. Thank you.
Great question. Some of the things we've tried, which probably didn't really work, were having things like a time release on discussion, so that a student would have to post, for example, a comment or a question before they could then receive one back. And so you can kind of design complex systems to try and get some back and forth discussion. You can try limiting the word limits, set word limits in terms of the length of their responses. That's problematic, though, it turns out, if you're wanting then to assess them on the quality of the responses, because the students often lose their minds about what they should focus on in 200 words versus 500, when you really don't care, you just want them to be talking, right? And so I think one of the things that ultimately, if you really do want to get that dialogue, two things: either you hold the live session and you get them chatting that way, because that's where it's going to be most authentic, and or you role model. So when a student posts something, you post back with a question or a comment, And if you get a few good, all it takes is a few good students, which depending on the cohorts you're teaching, you can definitely achieve this. And if students then see what's happening and they start interacting that way, then the other students do it. What's difficult is when no students are doing it. And then sometimes, you know, we haven't faked being students, but, you know, sometimes I say, oh, a student had this question, and, you know, I'll put a question there that really is from me rather than a student. So there are little things that you can try and do to try and show them what you have in mind. But if it's not tied to assessment then and they're not participating, you know, probably the best thing is to schedule more live sessions, and hopefully you get the engagement from at least some of them. So I don't have a really good solution to that because we've tried a lot of different things, and it seems to be very operator dependent in terms of, you know, the particular students and also the staff. So if you're fostered that feeling of engagement and you're checking in regularly, that tends to go along with more student engagement and activity in the discussions is, you know, observation. But
great. So we have two more questions. I think that's about all time that we will have. One, the first question from Dr. Sarwat Nasreen. Could you please switch your video on and ask the question, Dr. Sarwat?
Ji, Assalamu alaikum and good morning, everyone. I'm sitting in clinic looking like a monster, so no videos. So it's a general question, and if it is not too related, I'm apologizing beforehand. One thing that I always used to feel when I was a student, especially and when I taught, is that bioethics is a general thing. I mean, it's for a science student, it's not 2 + 2 = 4. So there are lots of questions and lots of things that keep bothering you, I mean, and your audience and your students also. How to deal with that, meaning for the beginners, how to keep them focused and bring them back to the point. I think Dr. Amir, if he remembers, I used to have lots of questions and never agreed to anything in the beginning. And secondly, when we are teaching students, they have, you know, there are lots of topics, organ donation, ethical dilemmas, etc., where their religious backgrounds, there's, you know, their environments, lots of things come up, their opinions. So how to, I know that discussions are thought-provoking and we're not supposed to come to a conclusion, but then how to conclude your session, you know? So many a times I would not agree and I would want answers and there would be no answers. And then I later realized, yeah, that was thought-provoking. So how do you end up that?
I think they're excellent questions that are generally applicable to a main challenge of teaching bioethics, particularly when you're teaching it to clinicians or scientists.
Yeah.
To focus it in the online environment and to sort of continue on the discussion of the discussion boards, I think it's often can be a challenge because the students who are most likely, for example, to start engaging online are the ones who are very passionate about a topic. And sometimes that's great, although it can be intimidating for other students because they think, oh, that student was so clever, I'm not going to post. But sometimes it's a little problematic because maybe it's really off topic or it is a very strong view that is maybe not ideally worded, for example, but because they're the only students commenting, you don't want to kind of shut them down or discourage them. So you have to simultaneously teach them, but also try and encourage them to want to keep doing it. And I think that's where we do find it occasionally challenging. And sometimes students will write to me privately and say, I didn't want to post this on the discussion board. So one of the key things that I've taught my team, I think, which is not always popular, not just in ethics, but in other parts of the uni, is to give students the opportunity to post anonymously. There are two schools of thought. Some people say, look, this is problematic because then students don't learn and they also may sometimes be rude. In my experience, they're generally not rude. Giving them that option can make some students feel safe. And then often students who have posted anonymously will then chime in, you know, identifying themselves once they realize that they don't look stupid and that they are going to be treated respectfully. So I'm probably not quite answering the general question of the challenge of the inconclusiveness of bioethics, but that comes back, I think, to that core skill we're trying to get students to learn of thinking critically and reasoning. And that's where the discussion party is so vital. And if you can't get that in kind of a discussion board thing, then having some sessions where students can engage and talk, or where you can at least provide them with different viewpoints so that they can get a feel for that process, I think is really essential and is the thing that we really need to focus on in our learning activities.
Thanks, thank you. And I agree with the part of anonymity. I would, you know, that would be the one student I would be. Thank you, thanks a lot.
So in fact, Dominique, you've managed to bring onto the screen people whom we haven't seen in years, including Dr. Sarwat. I don't even know which country she's talking from right now, but it's great to have you back on the screen. And
I'm in
so
Dubai, and I loved the discussion.
Thank you for joining us. Okay, so we have one question from our CBEC group, and then going to Fasiha.
Again, Swaleha here. I think one of the things that the idea that we're toying with currently is to kind of have some participants online, but some physical, so that, you do not have a lot of people in one room, and that's basically due to the logistics of the pandemic. So how do you then ensure that you're able to engage with the participants online? Because it's always easier to engage with participants who are face-to-face, right? So what are some of the things to kind of keep in mind?
I think that is a real challenge. It's a challenge we're currently experiencing with just Zoom meetings for staff. The idea was that, we used to always have at Deakin, at my university, people had the option of dialing in. And what happened was that anyone who was dialing in or was even on a video screen essentially got ignored. And it was the people in the room who were part of discussions. And so now, of course, everyone's been offline, and it's been a much more inclusive context. And people are saying, well, we shouldn't go back to that hybrid model because it just didn't work as well as having everyone online. But if you're in a situation where you need to, or you want to have some people online, be thinking very carefully about what you're doing in those sessions. Because if it is going to be, say, a case-based discussion section, and you've got 3 students who are online and you've got 5, 10, 20 in the room, that's going to be a very different experience for the 3 online. And so I'd be thinking about maybe structuring that activity in a way where it was, okay, we're going to go around the room and each person has their chance to say something, sort of maybe formalizing things that if everyone was in the room, you'd allow to happen more naturally. And or thinking perhaps that there would be some activities where, with that setup where you would split them into 2 groups and you'd have the people online. So I think the first step is exactly as you're doing, to be conscious that this is going to be a problem, and potentially a problem, and think about how you deal with it in order to ensure there's an equity of experience there.
Great. I think we can take the final question from Fasiha before we go on back to the main group, the CBEC group, but Fasiha first.
Dr. Dominique, I just want to ask one thing, because the university in which I'm teaching, we don't have an independent module of ethics. We actually have an amalgam model in which we teach ethics while teaching medicine and surgery and peds and whatever medical topics that we're teaching. So the challenge is the assessment thing. So what do you think in the situation that we are teaching, isn't it a good idea to assess ethics while assessing medicine as well? What are your take on it?
So in my medical program, technically our ethics, law and professionalism theme is fully integrated, but we have a number of themes and they do run really in parallel, but we're very privileged. We have a kind of quota of assessment time, at least in years 1 and 2, that we largely have control over. But there's a lot of emphasis on doing things in a more integrated way. And I think it depends. So to speak frankly, for example, every year when we have our OSCEs, our structured, kind of case-based clinical exams, I get invited, hey, why don't we put some ethics in this? And I'm always very wary because the ethics gets put in and I think, well, this would be a 10-minute ethics discussion. And instead they've got 8 minutes to sort out what's wrong with the patient and talk through their, treatment plan, and also grapple with the legal and ethical complexities of consent. And I said, that's not going to actually assess what I would want to assess from an ethics, law and professionalism perspective. And I'd say, look, I'd rather you focused on your clinical things. And in my ELP assessment, we're going to make sure that they know how to grapple with the consent. But so it's kind of choosing your battles. Sometimes it's good to have a presence there. And if you can be confident that the assessors will be able to tick off, did the students recognize that they needed to ask for consent and did they do that? It's not really assessing anything important from my perspective, but it's good to have the inclusion of ethics there. But if I really want to be confident that they can deal with some kind of ethical complexity, then if you don't have that curriculum space for a particular assessment task, you have to fight for it. Or you have to say, look, we're not going to have that opportunity to assess formally. What can I do in class, or what can I do particularly online that will give the students the chance to be tested and to get some feedback, so that if they realize they don't know something, they will be motivated to learn it. So it's not actually part of their formal assessment, but you give them that opportunity to learn something that you think is important. And that's not ideal, but it's better than saying, oh, well, we won't worry about that learning.
Great. So I think before we wind up the session, because we've gone over time, Dominique, what you've managed to do is not only engage everyone, practically everyone involved in bioethics education in Pakistan and Kenya, our alumni and beyond our alumni from all programs in Pakistan. You've also managed to pull out Dr. Muazzam from her sabbatical. So I didn't even realize that she is actually attending, and she's in the, and I would like to invite her to say a few words. Dr. Muazzam, if you could possibly, and could you please zoom in the camera? There is a technology available in that room to zoom in. Thank you.
Zoom in, zoom in. Hey, Dr. Martin. Hi.
Hello.
How are you?
Nice to see you.
Yeah, good to see you. It's been a long time. Well, as Dr. Amir said, actually, I came in a little bit late. I was sitting there. And I just want to add to what Amir has said already. Thank you very much for doing the session for us. And as has been pointed out, we've drawn a lot of people because with the COVID, it's a learning time for us, because as you probably know, we did one module and we have very intensive modules here on the ground, and then it all went out of the window. And so we went through a learning phase also as to how to convert everything online. But anyway, thank you very much. And maybe once all this crap is over, we will get you something we've been planning for many years, remember? That we have to get you over here so you're standing here with our students and faculty in person. So hope everything's okay with you. Australia is having a rough time too.
Nothing that we can complain about, but thank you. It's lovely to be kind of with you here virtually, and I also am really hoping to be able to come in person and see you again soon.
As we say, inshallah, that too will happen.
Exactly.
Thank you again, Dominic. Thank you.
Thank you.
So Dominic, it's been actually a wonderful experience getting all these three areas so clearly discussed, and with so much discussion and so many questions and comments being raised by us, by our colleagues. One thing that actually one learns is that the